Well, hello everybody. This is Dr. Jeff Horowitz, and it is a pleasure to be with you this evening. Tonight we're going to talk about the no-brainer Class 2 composite. Just trying to find a way to give you more predictable restorations and possibly a simpler way to eliminate microleakage. So this is all about me. Don't want to waste too much time here. I think you've all had the opportunity to read about me, but greetings from Myrtle Beach. That's where our practice is, in Conway, South Carolina, right next door to Myrtle Beach. That is my email address at the bottom. Please feel free to reach out to me at any time if you have any questions that we're unable to answer on this webinar. And if you do put questions in on the webinar, I'll try to get to as many as I possibly can and stay within the constraints that we have. So I am a member of Catapult Education. I am one of the key opinion leaders, and we work with many companies out there. We do a lot of live education, and we help a lot of companies develop products, and we test a lot of products for them. And so with those opportunities, we really get to see the highlights, get to find out which materials are performing well, and many times speak about those materials once we determine that they're appropriate for clinical use. So that brings me to the disclosure for the program, which is to say that as a Catapult Group member, we do form relationships. They are not financial remuneration for developing clients for companies, but we develop relationships where if we determine that there are products that are especially good in the clinical setting, we may speak on their behalf, and at times we will then be given honorarium to speak on a company's behalf, although there is no direct compensation for any type of customer acquisition. So today I'd like to thank Zest Dental Solutions, Danville, for their support of this program, and certainly thank you to Viva Learning for creating this opportunity. So let's get right into some of the problems associated with deep Class 1 and Class 2 resins. Now, the title of this program is the No-Brainer Class 2 resin, and so we're going to spend more of our time focusing there, but keep in mind that when we talk about these types of restorations, what we're talking about are the bread and butter posterior restorations that we're all doing every day. The sad part about posterior resins is that in Class 2 application, approximately 40% of these restorations are going to be subjected to microleakage and end up showing signs of recurrent decay at the cervical margin. So this is actually an article that I wrote for Inside Dentistry talking about a lot of these points. That'll be coming out in Inside Dentistry, I believe, next month, and just on how to increase the predictability of Class 2 restorations. So let's talk about some of the reasons that we see such a high rate of microleakage and recurrent decay. And some of these are obvious, maybe some not so obvious. There are also other reasons that these restorations are not always favorable for clinicians. But microleakage, I think, has to be mentioned first. It is clearly one of the largest reasons we see failure of these restorations. We know that inherent to composite resin, that shrinkage is a component that affects all resins in one form or another, and certainly shrinkage stress goes right along with that. There are certainly issues with incomplete polymerization, incomplete light curing associated with these restorations. And then there's a time concern, because in order to do these types of restorations properly, we know that it takes a certain amount of time. And if we don't charge a fee commensurate with the amount of time that we're taking, it becomes very stressful in the practice and very non-profitable. So let's dive into each of these problems that we see with Class 2 resins. The first one being microleakage. I know most of you are familiar with what microleakage is, but I thought I would put an official definition in here, which is the diffusion of bacteria, oral fluids, and ions and molecules into the tooth at the filling material interface. So we know that microleakage is something that occurs very often. It is very closely associated with a gap, with the marginal gap that we see, and so we need to figure out a way to eliminate as much of that microleakage as is possible. So what we look at when we look at different materials and applications are, what are the materials that will minimize that marginal gap and minimize microleakage at the same time? So this is actually a study that was done. This was done by Dr. Lawson down at the University of Alabama at Birmingham, and he looked at microleakage with several different types of materials. And so using some of the well-known materials, used a dual cured bulk fill material, used a self-cured bulk fill material, and used a layered material in this study. And what was seen in this study was that the material that performed the best, both at finite element analysis of how much microleakage there was at the margin and the simple dye test or stain test, marginal stain, was that the material that seemed to perform the best was a dual cured material, so not exclusively light cured material. It also happened to be a bulk fill material, and in this case it was a material from Zest Danville called Bulk EZ. So let's explore a little bit more about this. So as we look at the dye stain from this test, we see that this is very easy to just look at and see that even with this incremental layering technique in a light cured application with a very good material, this is not to speak against any other materials, this is actually a great material, and it performed pretty well in this test. But you can see that with regard to the stain test, that even the Bulk EZ, a dual cured bulk fill resin material, was actually able to outperform an incrementally layered light cured material. So let's move on. And let's talk about the next thing outside of microleakage, or something that actually leads up to microleakage, and that is shrinkage and shrinkage stress. We know that all resins have some amount of polymerization shrinkage. As the dual carbon bonds turn to covalent bonds, we see an inherent shrinkage, and that can be anywhere from 1% up to 6%, depending upon the formulation and the curing conditions. There's also some other factors that will play into that, such as C factor, the shape of the preparation, the number of surfaces that you're bonding to. But what we found with a polymerization shrinkage is that light cured bulk fill materials yield more cuspal deflection than incremental filling techniques. So right away we know that there's been an issue with some of the bulk fill materials, particularly in the light cured realm. So in order to combat that, they developed a technique, the incremental layering technique, which does seem to reduce some of these stress forces and maintain better bonds. What's really interesting, though, is that what we're seeing is the dual cured bulk fillable materials are showing similar shrinkage and shrinkage stress forces as that of light cured incrementally layered restorations. So there's also been some other techniques mentioned using, say, flowable resins, using maybe even glass ionomers as a first layer to overcome some of the stresses and create the concept of an elastic cavity wall. Unfortunately, what we find is that when multiple materials are used, that the chemistry doesn't always allow for that to be the case, and shrinkage stress doesn't always decrease. So for me, in my practice, and I know for many, staying within a brand, staying within a particular company's chemistry, and understanding the materials that are going in to control these forces that can make our restorations less predictable becomes very important. I think this is an obvious one, but it's amazing to me how little we stop and think about this. So we know most bulk filled light cured materials, the largest distance I've ever seen among any of these materials is advertised at 6 millimeters of depth of cure. Now, that's a pretty good long way, and that's assuming proper output from the light. It's assuming proper angulation from the light, and it's also assuming that the light source is placed directly over the restoration. Now, we know that that's not always the case. We know that that doesn't always happen. So I think one of the biggest shortcomings of bulk-filled light-cured materials is that we just don't get enough light to it to create full polymerization. And with poor polymerization, we're dead in the water. We know that there are going to be recurring problems with that. So let's talk about what's important in light curing. There are many variables when it comes to light curing. So the durability and longevity of a restoration is greatly dependent on the accurate delivery of the energy required to polymerize the resin. Dr. Richard Price of Dalhousie University had actually presented these core variables in light curing, core being an acronym, one for being the type of curing light that you're using. We know that there is plasma, we know that there's quartz halogen, we knew that there's LED, each of them putting off different energy levels of light, slightly different wavelengths of light. And so understanding the wavelength and energy that's being emitted is absolutely critical, making sure that our light source is calibrated, that we're getting the energy that it's supposed to have. And then there, of course, there's the operator's technique. If the light happens to be angulated, we might have undercuts in the preparation that will never see the photons from the light source. So when that happens, we get incomplete curing maybe at the deepest or axial part of the preparation. Also, as we look away so as not to look directly at the blue light, we sometimes find that the head of the light will drift away from the restoration, and when that happens, we are not getting that same depth of cure. Again, 6 millimeters depth of cure, which is about the maximum, assumes that the light is starting 6 millimeters from the deepest part of the placed composite restoration. And then certainly each composite has its own requirement for what type of energy and what type of wavelength it needs in order to be properly cured. So here's a pretty big concern, is that the International Standards Organization, the ISO, does not have very much in the way of requirements pertaining to light curing performance. And so really they're more concerned about whether or not there's ultraviolet light being emitted from these lights than they are to making sure that these lights are calibrated to make sure that we're getting adequate curing through our preparations. So again, off on the right side of the slide, you'll see that there are different types of lights. There are different types of beam profiles. How does the energy get emitted from the light, and how large is the head? Do we have to move it around in order to get full curing? Some lights will deliver the power evenly. Some will have hot and cold spots. Do we want to use ramped or slow or fast? High heat? There's a lot of variables when it comes to curing. And so anytime there's a lot of variables in any restoration that I'm placing, it kind of makes me nervous. So if my goal is trying to figure out a way to make restorations more predictable, then I want to take as much of the variability out as I possibly can. And so with that, I actually have been placing dual-cured bulk-fill materials, bulk-filled resins, for a long time now in my practice. Number one is that it takes the issue of light curing out of the question. There is no maximum depth of cure. This is a material called Bulk EZ. It's made by Danville, and Danville is no stranger to the dual-cured market and to the adhesion market. Dr. Ray Bertolotti, who has done a lot of research and actually brought the self-etching technology over from Japan to the United States, has been working with dual-cured and self-cured materials in order to direct shrinkage and to make sure that stress forces are limited, and to also make sure that we don't have the concerns with light that we were seeing. This is a little video that talks about time, because one of the concerns that we hear about self-cured and dual-cured materials is that they might take more time, when exactly the opposite is true. In fact, I find that I can do multiple restorations at one time once I have an area isolated. So you can watch this video briefly and see what happens. In a bulk-filled dual-cured material, we're going to fill preparation to the top. That's what you see going on the left side. We know that in order to reduce the shrinkage stress in a light cured material, that we have to place multiple layers, and that we have to come in with the light, depending on the light source, anywhere from 10 to 20 seconds for each increment that we place. We have to condense how much of the material is actually being pulled back from the margin if we try to condense. And so with the use of a flowable material that can be filled to the very top of the preparation, we now have the ability, with a lot of predictability, to place a restoration that will have low polymerization stress, low shrinkage. The shrinkage will be directed not towards a light source like we would typically see, but actually towards the margin. And hopefully what that amounts to is a lower likelihood for recurrent decay. And so recurrent decay is something that we see all the time, and especially in Class 2 restorations. So it's not a happy day when these patients walk into your practice. My goal when I restore a tooth is to not have to restore that tooth again for a very long time. That's how I keep my patients happy. That's how I keep referrals coming into the office. And so this answer has been around for a very long time. And Dr. Ray Bertolotti first described this technique with a material called StarFlow. He used a self-etching primer at the time and placed a material called StarFlow, which cured on its own, so there was unlimited depth of cure. And he was actually able to show in this article the directed shrinkage technique for posterior composite placement, that you could place these types of Class 2 resins without a lot of microleakage, and with the ability to have some strong predictability because of the diminished microleakage and the fact that the shrinkage stress is being limited. So this is a dual-cured, bulk-filled composite resin. This is the delivery system in this case. What I really like about this system is the small mixing tip. so we don't have a lot of waste. This can be bent. This tip that you see can be bent. It comes in two sizes. There's a 17 and a 19 gauge. Typically, I'm using the 19 gauge for everything, so I don't have to keep a lot of inventory around. The shade choices are pretty nice, and it seems to be really a nice delivery system for us. The other thing that I'll say about it is it's efficient. Once I place my matrix band and get isolation, it's getting filled to the top. There is a 90-second period where we are going to allow the dual-cured material to begin polymerization on its own. That's so we don't get shrinkage stress towards the light source. I always hear that seems like a lot of time, and actually it's not. Because if I have 2 or 3 restorations, guess what? It's still the same 90 seconds. When you add the time that you're taking with a light cured material to place an increment, light cure, place an increment, light cure, place an increment, light cure, you're well above the 90 seconds in the first place. So I will use that 90 seconds typically to change out burrs in my handpiece to get ready for the finishing process after I place the restoration. The other advantage to using a dual cured bulk fill material is, again, the unlimited depth of cure. If you look at the periodontal probe in the right photograph, it's not uncommon to see a class 2 restoration, particularly in the molar area, go to 7 millimeters of depth from the bottom of the box to the top of the cusp tip. So with most of the conventional bulk fill light cured materials, if we were to place that, we are already above and beyond the depth of cure limitations of a lot of those materials, meaning that I'd have to do it in increments anyway, which ends up taking more time. So we also know that with the dual cured allowing the material to begin curing on its own prior to final polymerization with the light, that we can direct the shrinkage not towards the light source but towards the margin and end up with a smaller gap formation. And that's absolutely critical if we're going to increase the predictability. The other thing is there seems to be this thought that you've got to have a condensable material in order to be able to place in order to be able to obtain a tight proximal contact, and nothing could be further from the truth. In the article that I discussed earlier by Dr. Bartolotti, he actually began discussing bitine rings and sectional matrices in the early 90s that would help us to establish proximal contact without having to actually pack a composite. We also know that there's issues with packing composite because if there's any stickiness to the material, you can get pullback, which can end up leading to voids in the restorative material. So in the past, we talked about sectional matrices, bitine rings. There's a lot of good systems out there now. I know Triodent makes a nice system. I actually use the Mega V and the Contact Matrix, both from Danville, depending on the application. These are great matrix systems, and we are able to make a solid contact not by pressing material up against the band and not by packing or condensing material, but simply by having a properly formed band, a properly formed matrix that separates the teeth and places forces where they need to be. So here's a case that I did. This is actually a case where a patient presented with a poor proximal contact in the existing amalgam restoration. There was some microleakage on the occlusal margin, and so we decided to fix this with a Class 2 bulk EZ posterior composite restoration. And so let's go to work here, see what we have. So we get into the preparation, and that is actually the contact matrix that you see there from Danville. We've placed some Ultra Etch. That is an Ultradent product, but again, that's just a 35% acid etch. You can use whatever you want. That is placed selectively only on enamel. Why? Because we are going to use an 8th generation self-etching primer and adhesive from Danville called Prelude 1. Now, the nice thing about Bulk EZ is that it is compatible with many of the 8th generation products that are out there, but I would caution that it is important to use a dual cured activator, except in the case of staying within the Danville family and using the Prelude 1 product. Because this is a one-step self-etching adhesive and the chemistry was designed to be used with Bulk Fill EZ, we do not a dual cured activator in this case to be used with our Bulk Fill dual cured composite resin material. So this is Prelude 1. If you prefer the two-step technique, that's fine. I also love Prelude material, their dual bottle material, and that is absolutely acceptable if you want to use that type of chemistry. Have no issue with it. In this case, we're going to use Prelude 1, and because it is a self-etch material, we're going to use the self-etch component on the dentin, and we have acid etch that has already been placed. The acid etch will sit for 15 seconds. We will then place our Prelude 1 into the preparation. We'll use a micro brush and we will agitate that over the dentin. We will agitate it, and this is absolutely critical. The most common mistake I see in the adhesive process is when people are using, when dentists are using a self-etching adhesive, that they're not allowing enough time in contact to actually allow the self-etching component to etch what it's trying to etch. So I see people place these primers and adhesives down and let them sit for 5 seconds, 7 seconds, 8 seconds, and you're just not going to get the type of etch that you need in that case. So we agitate it over the dentin, we place it over the enamel as well, and then we allow 15 seconds from the time we started applying. So we need for 15 seconds to go by to get an adequate etch, and then this step also becomes very important. We need to dry this off with warm air. I don't know how many are familiar with the ADEC warm air dryer, but this is actually a critical piece of equipment. Even with water separators in our systems now, it is almost impossible to absolutely keep water out of our airlines, and this warm air dryer actually uses a Venturi tube, so does not allow any water to come through the system, and it will blow warm air into the preparation, and that's critical. We need to do that for about 5 seconds to evaporate the carrier that brings over the primer and adhesive. Otherwise, we could be diminishing the physical characteristics of the primer and adhesive. So once we get that evaporated, now that is my Bulk EZ tip that you see there. It's a dual component because it does have a dual curing capability. So it will mix in the tip, and I will fill it all the way up to the top of the preparation. There's no layers, no nothing here. So you can see that we filled the preparation up to the top with the restorative material, and we're going to allow 90 seconds for the self-curing component to begin polymerizing. Again, that is so that we can direct the shrinkage towards the margin, towards that cervical area where we tend to see the biggest gaps and where we tend to see the most microleakage. So when you first do this, yes, 90 seconds seems like a long time. You learn that it's actually taking you longer with the light cured material in increments, then you say, well, let me just find something else to do at that time. And so that's exactly what we do. My assistant keeps an eye on it to make sure that the area stays isolated. And while she's doing that, I'll be changing out and getting into finishing mode, swapping out some burrs and doing any kind of cleanup that I can for that 90 seconds. And it does go quickly. It's just a little bit of a paradigm shift. But it's interesting. So you can see from the photograph on the right-hand side that the band has been removed and the sectional matrix and wedge have been removed. And you can already see what looks like a good contact, but we'll show it to you again at the end. And the material's been filled all the way up to the top. It's been light cured. Once the band is removed, we'll give it another cure from the facial and the lingual. And then we'll go straight into finishing. And for me, that will consist of an ET carbide burr, and then we'll also use some fine and extra fine diamond footballs, and I'll go across the top. It's very quick. I find it very easy to polish like this. Sometimes I will then use a brownie point by Shofu, and the initial polish, the initial finish will be with those burrs that you see there. My fine polish comes with ASAP polishers that you see there, clinician's choice, but again, it doesn't matter if you have a polishing system that you like. I would suggest that you use whatever's working well for you. There's a lot of good polishing systems out there. That happens to be the one that I use in my practice. And so that is the finished restoration, and yes, it is a little bit on the light side. In this case, I asked the patient if they wanted a composite placed over the top of it, but you know, this was a patient, number one, that you couldn't see this restoration. Number two, you know, they were concerned about function and long-term predictability, and this really is what gives us the best fighting chance. Now, I will say that the color allowances in the bulk EZ do allow for a really good color match. I could have gone with possibly a slightly darker material there, but the patient was very happy. And this is really, for me, more about longevity and predictability. And so that's what we ended up with. Now, what's the other option here? The other option is if you're really looking for that, American Academy of Cosmetic Dentistry finish, or it happens to be in the aesthetic zone, then you can certainly come over the top with a veneering composite, whether it be a nano hybrid of your choice, whatever you like to use. I've done that at times, so I'm going to fill it most of the way, and the last step will be just a little bit of veneering composite if I choose to do it. I will tell you that in most of my posterior restorations, I just do not see the need to do that. So there's a couple of questions that I'm going to jump into real quick before we move on. The first question that I have is there a limit on how deep restoration can be to add the composite to get adequate depth of cure? Great question. The answer to that is with bulk EZ, there is absolutely no limit on how deep you can go. So there is the dual cured component, and as long as you allow that material to sit for 90 seconds before you hit it with the light, then you will get complete curing, and so there is no depth of cure limitation. So that is a great question. On also, let's see, we also have a question about cavity disinfection, and absolutely. So some people like benzalkonium chloride. Some people will use a chlorhexidine scrub, which has also been shown to reduce MMP formation. Yeah, all of those are absolutely compatible with what we're doing here. So let's move on. Thanks for those questions, and feel free to keep them coming. Let's move on. And so in this case, we've got that bicuspid that we're going to go through the system with. So of course I'm still going to selectively etch enamel. We know that the best bond strengths to enamel come when enamel is etched, especially if the enamel has not been altered in any other way. So we're going to selectively etch the enamel, and then I'm going to my 8th generation Prelude 1 all-in-one bottle, self-etching primer and adhesive. And again, because it is in the same family, I do not need a dual cured activator for this to work with my bulk fill EZ. And so we go on, and we'll see, I'm back to my ADEC warm air dryer. This to me is a must-have in every dental office. And then once 9 seconds has gone by after using the warm air dryer, remember we allow our Prelude 1 to sit for 15 seconds so that we get an adequate dentin etch. We then evaporate the carrier, and that's what we're doing with our warm air dryer prior to light curing the adhesive. And then no dual cured activator. We will go straight to our bulk fill EZ, which is what we'll see in the next slide. And in this case, I didn't go all the way to the top. I went almost all the way to the top. And then I will use a nano hybrid, or if you prefer, you know, whatever it is that you use for your aesthetic restorations. Again, I don't find the need to have to do this a lot, but it works very well. Also, I might mention again that there are 2 different size tips, although I typically only use the smaller tip, which is the 19 gauge tip. Very easy delivery system. Again, I use ET burrs. This is a mosquito-shaped diamond that I'll sometimes use for some curing if there's a lot of extra bulk and I don't want to hit that all with my carbide burr. We will use our diamond football burrs as well for the initial finishing. I'll also come in there with a brownie point, typically at about 10,000 RPM, 15,000 RPM, and then we'll go to our final polish, which for me is going to be with ASAP polishers. But again, whatever your polishing system of choice, then I'm absolutely good with that. So that's a happy day, and you know, just this afternoon, very interesting, I happen to have a patient that that was going away and was in a time crunch. I ended up having to do 3 quadrants of operative dentistry, multiple class 2 restorations. I wish it had been a week ago so I could have used some of those slides for this presentation. But I ended up doing 3 separate quadrants on her. All the quadrants had class 2 restoration, and each of the quadrants had at least 2 class 2 restorations. And I was able to get through this pretty quickly, and what's amazing about that is that it's because of the time saving. The biggest concern that I hear when people first hear about this dual cured bulk fill material is there's no way I can wait for 90 seconds. And the 90 seconds goes by like nothing, especially if you're moving over to your finishing products and changing some things out and getting prepared for the next part of the procedure. But when you think about it, it's the 90 seconds one time. When we do incrementally layered techniques with light curing, it ends up taking longer. I know that because I've done it. And it really has become a very nice system. So the bottom line here is that what we're trying to do is find a way to decrease microleakage, to direct shrinkage in the direction that we want to go towards the margin as opposed to towards the light. We want to fight the battle of incomplete curing, which happens to the best of us. We want to fight the battle of time, which again, it becomes really, really difficult to charge enough money for class 2 restorations that take a really long time. So having a way to be efficient like this, it just really makes life easier. And I will say too that we have been very, very successful in reducing the amount of microleakage and recurrent decay that we've seen on class 2 restorations using these products. The theory is tried and true. It's been around since the 90s. It's just that the chemistry has finally caught up and they're doing an amazing job with it. So you can increase predictability, you can do it in less time, and it can be a no-brainer. So with that, I'm going to terminate the lecture. We have a bunch of questions in here. So I'd like to use the remaining time to address some of the questions that have come up. So the first question I see here is from Alicia. It says, what is the reason for the veneering? Is it because of weak wear resistance? And the answer to that is no. It is simply because of it is not as highly aesthetic as some of the nano-hybrid materials are or some of the microfills out there. So yes, we do like Cure the Bulk EZ. So we finish the 90-second self-cure component. We allow that to happen first. Then we will light cure the Bulk EZ and then come in with a layer of veneering composite. It does not have to do at all with the physical properties of the material. That's a great question because in toughness and wear resistance, this material does extremely well. And be happy in email to share all of that data with you. But no, it is not a wear resistance or fracture problem. The only reason to veneer this would be if you felt the need or if the patient felt the need, a very high demand cosmetic patient in the aesthetic zone. But typically most of these restorations do not get veneered with any other composite in my office. So let's see. Susan here says, what is the consistency of the Bulk EZ? Yes, it does flow like a flowable composite. There's also a, there was a second question here. Hopefully I can tackle both of these at the same time about air voids. And perhaps I can go back a couple of slides. Let me go back to, there we go. Go back to this slide. So when we inject this flowable material, we're putting the cannula tip to the bottom of the preparation and slowly allowing it to come out, and it will flow up and fill in the preparation. Actually, as part of the testing process, I had actually placed this material into a lot of plastic teeth with a clear matrix and then looked to see what the marginal voids looked like. And I was absolutely amazed that I had fewer voids in this material than when I used a packable material. So great question. The consistency, yes, it is like a slightly thicker flow, but it does have amazing wettability, so it conforms to the pulpal floor very nicely. Very rarely will I take maybe an instrument like a perio probe to drag it maybe towards the cavo surface margin. but for the most part, it is filling in very nicely with very few voids. Let's see what else we have here for questions. Do you think you would get better sealing and adaptation of the composite by initial layer of a good flowable composite? And the answer to that is this serves just like a good flowable composite. One of the papers that I mentioned, both in the article that I wrote for Inside Dentistry and in this lecture, actually looked at using multiple materials in order to reduce polymerization stress. And it's certainly a good idea in theory. So there's some people that'll perhaps a resin-modified glass ionomer or a low-filled flowable material in there. But what was interesting was that polymerization stress is not just reliant on the amount of filler. It's not just reliant on the C forces placed in the preparation. It's not just reliant on where the light source is placed. There's a lot of factors, including the chemical composition of the materials that you're using. And what they found in that study was that when you mix materials like that, that it may not do what you think it's doing as far as reducing polymerization stress, particularly as you have two conflicting chemical materials working at the same time. So excellent question there. Let's see. Oh, a bunch of them coming in. This is great. Trevini says, does the bulk fill come in flowable and packable? No, there is no packable. There is no need for a packable. Danville does make a very nice packable composite resin as well. But the shrinkage amounts are as low with this material as any material out there. And in fact, with in one of the slides I showed you earlier, there was less polymerization stress and less polymerization shrinkage, resulting in a smaller microgap than even the incrementally layered Filtech that I showed you in that slide. There's another question about warming the composite to make flow a little bit easier. And certainly that's a possibility. Again, thermal changes can change chemistry a little bit, especially with regard to polymerization. I have not found a need to warm it and make it flow better. Actually flows very nicely. Some people will use the 19 gauge tip in order to make the material come out of the cannula a little bit easier. But certainly that's a great question, but I've not found a need at all to have to warm this product. Let's see here. Helder says, when light curing, after the 90 seconds of self-curing, if the cavity is deeper than the 6 millimeters, will we not be able to light cure the deeper part of it? An excellent question. No, you will still get complete polymerization or great polymerization through a chain chemistry reaction. So I will actually be happy to share some of that chemistry with you. That's getting pretty in detail here, but the chemistry is really pretty innovative with regard to using this product with the Prelude One, and I think that has a lot to do with why it's been so successful. And let's see, Nima, as far as having air bubbles, have you tested yourself? And yes, I have. I actually have, as I said, injected into plastic teeth. I've done that myself with plastic matrices that I could see through. I've done it with metal matrices and then pulled them away, and these are from Typodont teeth, and we've done very, very well as far as not seeing voids. I've been extremely pleased with what we've seen. So let's see what Peter has to say. Do you think you would get better sealing and adaptation of the composite? Oh, I'm sorry, we read that one already. Let's see what else we have here. Let's see, with the exception of certain aesthetic cases that require long periods of sculpting, are there any disadvantages to a dual cured resin? And I would say that would probably be the only one, is that it does there is a tiny learning curve with how much to inject without creating too much flash. But I'll tell you, after using the material for a little while, you'll get where there's not a lot of excess flash. If you get a little bit of flash, it can actually be dragged with a plastic instrument or any other type of operative instrument, and there is no real other disadvantage to using the dual cured material. Now, generically, dual cured materials, we don't know, because there are some self-cured materials out there that have been out there for a while that are not performing as well. I will say for this one, all the research that I have seen come out in literature at this point is all extremely favorable, and we're seeing that the performance is at the level of an incrementally layered composite without the disadvantages of having unpolymerized material, which is happening to everybody because we're not all getting the light to where it needs to go. And that's just an absolute. I don't care, you know, how hard we try. We either don't have our lights calibrated correctly. We know a lot of the light testers that are in office can be inaccurate themselves. We know that there are hot and cold spots. We know that there's materials that get onto the light, or different sizes of light tips and different types of lights. There's just so much variability in light sources and in depth of preparations. I actually got in the habit, I have several slides where I took pictures with the periodontal probe, and I was absolutely amazed at how many class 2 preparations will go more than 6 millimeters from cusp tip to the proximal box, to the bottom of the proximal box. So I think that has covered most of the questions here. I do not see any more questions at this point. Let's see, here is another one. How much pressure do you use when placing the bulky Z, and is there any cohesion with the cannula or removal? That's a great question, and no. What's really nice is that I keep the cannula tip all the way to the bottom and then slowly extrude on my way out. And that creates a tiny bit of flash, usually at the most posterior part of the restoration, which I will then drag. I'll actually use the cannula tip to drag it back, or I will use a periodontal probe sometimes to do that. So let me see if anything else has come through. There was a question about the pH of this, and what's nice about this system is that the pH is high enough that it does a great job of getting a solid etch on the dentin, but yet still allows for the dual cure abilities of the material. And then Matthew just sent in a question asking about the ring systems. And again, the ring system that you see in this slide here, that is actually called the contact matrix. There are times when I prefer an all metal. I don't know if you can see this well or not. These are actually angled for mesial and distal. So these metal rings will actually adapt beautifully. Particularly in the wider applications and for wider proximal boxes. I really like that type of an application, and it adapts well around the tooth as well. and that is by Zest Danville. But Zest Danville also makes a Mega V-ring, and I'm not sure if I had that in here. I thought that I did. The Mega V-ring looks similar to the Triodent system, which is also a really, really nice system. But what I will tell you, those are probably my 3 favorite ring systems that are out there. And so I would either stick with the Triodent or I would use the Danville materials, the Mega V-ring, which is a plastic ring more like the Triodent, and the Contact Matrix, which is this metal one that you see here. And what burr do you use to adjust occlusion? Again, I'm using a red stripe football-shaped burr. Every company out there makes one of those. I think those are the OS burrs. I use a fine, which is the red stripe, and then I finish with an extra fine. And then I'm typically using an ET burr on the interproximal areas. Sometimes if there's a little bit of extra flash, I will use a mosquito-shaped diamond to contour that more quickly. So we're just about coming up on the top of the hour. I really want to thank all of you for sticking around for this. This is a really amazing time in dentistry. The chemistry is just getting so good. As a mentor at the Coyce Center, one of the things that we're charged with is trying to make dental work more predictable. The idea is not how do we do the procedure again. It's really more about how do we keep that patient from having to have the same procedure done again in the future. And so for me, anything I can do to increase predictability is a practice builder, and that's worked really well in our practice in Humboldt, Conway, South Carolina. So with that, I will bid you all a good evening. I want to thank you for your attention. Let me go to the last slide again, and there is my email address at the bottom, jhorowitzdmd@gmail.com. Please feel free to reach out to me, or come see me at a live lecture sometime with Catapult Education. So thanks again to Viva Learning and to Zest Danville for their support of this lecture, and I hope you all have an excellent evening.